meeting number 75 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Today, all members and witnesses are appearing in person in the room. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to remind committee members to wait until I recognize you by name. Do that by simply raising your hand since everybody's in the room to get my attention, and I will, along with the clerk, maintain a speaking order. You have the option of speaking in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available by using the headset in the room. I would remind all those participating, if there is a loss of translation services, please get my attention. We'll suspend while it is being corrected as well. So the other part as well is no screenshots are allowed to be taken in the room while the meeting is in session. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the decision made by the committee on Tuesday, June the 13th, the committee will receive a briefing on accessible transportation for persons with disabilities from the Office of the Auditor General. I would like to welcome our witnesses, beginning with, as you're aware, the Auditor General, due to family situation, is not available to be with us today. The Assistant Auditor General, Madame Thomas, is here. Welcome. Mr. Duvnak, Principal, is with us. Susie Fortier, Director, is with us as well. We will start with the opening statement from Mr. Thomas for 5 minutes, after which we will open the floor to questions. And since we only have one panel today, we'll just keep going around. With that, Ms. Thomas, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, thank you for giving us the opportunity to discuss our report on accessible transportation for persons with disabilities, which was tabled in the House of Commons on the 27th of March. I would like to recognize the fact that this hearing is taking place on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Today, I am accompanied by Milan Duvnak, the Senior Director responsible for audit, and Susie Fortier, the director who led the audit team. As part of this audit, we examined whether Via Rail, the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, and the Canadian Transportation Agency had worked to identify, eliminate, and prevent barriers to travelers with disabilities. In 2019 and 2020, more than 1 million people living with disabilities who traveled in a federally regulated mode of transportation encountered a barrier. We found that all 3 organizations had identified some barriers and taken steps to improve accessibility. Via Rail consulted with people with disabilities when designing its new fleet. The company also held consultations on its accessibility plans and training programs, as did the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority. However, improvements were still necessary in many important areas. For example, online information was not totally accessible. According to Statistics Canada, this is one of the most common barriers encountered by travelers with disabilities. Inadequate accessibility means that information is difficult to find or incorrect when using a screen reader. It is therefore difficult for people with disabilities to plan or book a trip themselves.
Found that staff and management did not always complete accessibility training. This can affect the service provided to travelers with disabilities and their companions. As the organization responsible for enforcing accessibility regulations in the Transportation Agency, the Canadian Transportation Agency identified accessibility barriers through its inspections, and it worked with transportation service providers to remove some. However, we found that the agency conducted few inspections, and it could only request complaint data from service providers in certain circumstances. Consistent access to this data would help the agency improve its oversight. Meanwhile, the Canadian Transport Security Authority and Via Rail focused on resolving individual complaints, and they missed opportunities to use complaint data to better understand travelers' lived experiences. Every person has a right to participate fully and equally in society. If access to these rights is delayed or denied, the impact is that some members of society are excluded or left behind. To further improve the accessibility of trains, planes, and other federally regulated modes of transportation, responsible organizations need to broaden their consultations with persons with disabilities, make their online content fully accessible, and use complaint data to identify, learn about, and prevent barriers. This work is necessary to achieve the federal government's goal of a barrier-free Canada by 2040. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening statement. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. We will now begin the questioning with Ms. Gray for 6 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for being here today from the AG's office. I want to start, you did mention this during your opening statements around the staff training and the mandatory training, both for managers and executives. And so looking at the numbers from your audit, they're quite high on how many, in particular, executives and managers either took the mandatory accessible training either late or didn't actually fulfill that mandatory training. So in your experience, how would you rate the mandatory training compliance at these transportation agencies compared to other agencies that maybe you've audited over time?
Thank you so much for the question, and I will start the answer, and then I will ask if Milan or Susie has anything to add. You're absolutely right. Training is critical. Training helps people develop their skills in order to deliver their services. It improves awareness and understanding, and it helps remove unconscious bias. When it comes to management, they have that additional responsibility of being supervisors. So in addition to building their skills, they need to support those who are in those positions and in those roles. With respect to their Via Rail in particular, 39% of their managers and executives took the training late, and an additional 17% had not taken the training at all at the time of our audit. I do believe that that has since changed, and I will ask my colleagues to maybe give you an update on that. But we did see that there were improvements that need to be made, and therefore we would say that they need to do better. I'll pass it over to.
So just to add to Ms. Thomas's answer, so we do know that, for example, for VIA, that most of the training, if not all, the managers have taken it, our latest information. And just to add also that it is, VIA had made accessibility training mandatory for all management. Okay, so that's a positive. And as Ms. Thomas stated, we did see that some training was not taken on time, but there's been some positive developments since. For CATSA, we did note that the training was mandatory for most of the managers, except for the managers that were not working directly with persons with disabilities. So for example, a manager that was in charge of maintaining, let's say, maintaining certain aspects that didn't have a frontline support, they did not have, they were not supposed to take that training, and we made a recommendation. In our view, all management should take training.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I guess part of that as well was this is mandatory training that comes through the regulator, and I know working previously in in the financial sector, there were training that we had to do as board and executive and then staff that were mandatory, and it was really pressed on us to make sure that we met those deadlines and that we met that. So where's the accountability here? I guess would be my question. And is this something that you've seen in other audits that you've done in other industries where there's mandatory training for different things that maybe aren't fulfilled, and who's ultimately accountable for that?
Thank you very much. So again, a good question in terms of accountability, because you're absolutely right. Managers and executives need to hold themselves accountable. During the course of our audit, we found that they were receptive to what we brought to them, and that they were made aware of these important responsibilities. I'll ask Suzie or Milan if they have anything additional to add.
We did make the recommendation that they ensure that their staff and their manager be trained. This specific regulation requires an update in training, a refresher training every 3 years, so they will have an opportunity to demonstrate if they are taking up the recommendation and be on time with the oversight of the regulator.
And great, thank you. And just to tie on to that as well, then presumably it would be the regulator that would hold them to account. So that would be the Canadian Transportation Agency, right? It would be the regulator to press on them to hold them to account, correct?
It's part of this, yes, as well as their accessibility plans. As part of their accessibility plans, they can define their timelines and their process, which has an accountability component from the review and consultation of person with disability. So they are also accountable to their client and to the population.
Great, thank you. And ultimately would be the minister that would hold the regulator to account, who then would hold those that they oversee account. Would that not be a correct sort of chain of a command, I guess you could say, for holding people to account?
In terms of the chain of command, I would start with the executives and management within the agency itself. It's important that they hold themselves accountable and that they understand the importance of training, that this isn't just a tick box exercise, that training is an important element of what they do in order to support their clients.
Just to add on to that, do you think that these particular organizations are or I guess why would you think these organizations might have been lax? Did you get any sense of that when you did your audit, why they were lax in this particular training? Was there a real rationale? Maybe it wasn't a priority, or they were focused on other things. Do you have a sense as to why this wasn't a priority for them?
We spoke to them, of course, when we examined this, but there was no specific reason why the training wouldn't have been taken. And as I mentioned just before, both organizations had identified mandatory training for all or most of their management.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. Mr. Long for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses, and good afternoon, colleagues. C-81, the Accessible Canada Act, I think was one of the most profound and transformational pieces of legislation that we passed. I know MP Shabbat was involved. I think MP Falk was involved in earlier HUMA days, and obviously our Minister Qualtrough. It's life-changing for Canadians. And I mean, obviously it was passed in 2019 with the goal to, have basically Canada barrier-free by 2040. And it hit home to me when, I had a constituent come in my office before we passed that act, and they literally couldn't get on a bus. They were in a wheelchair, and they couldn't access a bus. And, for those listening in, there's many people listening today, I mean, it covers, obviously, the federal government, then organizations that are regulated by the federal government, just for the record. Banks, airlines, phone companies, trucking, rail, shipping, what have you. And just one point I want to make before I ask questions is, you know, the Accessible Canada Act is good for everybody. I mean, ramps and elevators obviously are those to help the disabled, but they're also there to help people who are elderly, or it could be a mother with a stroller. Signs that are easily legible help people learning new language. Captions on TV help people in a busy, loud airport. So, you know, things that we will do, things that we will legislate are good for all Canadians. But, I mean, it's going to be a while. I mean, obviously there's great work happening, and we're going to get there, but it will take time. It'll take a lot of work on all Canadians. So my first question to you, Ms. Thomas, would be, in the audit, you found that while Via Rail and the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority consulted with persons with disabilities on their projects, persons with disabilities continued to face ongoing challenges, such as websites that are not accessible. Can you elaborate on that finding, please? And thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And online is often a place where many travelers start their journey. Travelers will expect complete and clear information. Persons with disabilities also need complete, clear, and accessible information. This makes the experience equitable for persons with disabilities. What we found during the course of our audit was that 17% of the online criteria in relation to Via Rail had not been met. Some of this information may not have affected a traveler's journey or a traveler's ability to book, but some of it would have. So, for example, a person with a disability or a person using a screen reader may get a wrong departure time, which could obviously affect their journey, their ability to plan their journey. We also found that there information for persons using a wheelchair. It wasn't always easy to find the accessibility in the stations, in which would require a person to go and click on each station to determine where they were going to be able to go and how they were going to be able to maneuver around the station. With respect to CATSA, we also looked at their online criteria and found that about 15% were not met. And with respect to CATSA, it was difficult to find out for a person traveling how they were going to get through security. Now, this might not affect how they were going to plan their journey, but it definitely could cause stress for the traveler when they were arriving at a station and when they were trying to get to the next place that they needed to be. I'll ask if I have anything to add.
And I'll just add on that we tested a large portion of these online criteria, which we have the numbers in here. We used international standards, and which are basically around the four principles: being perceivable, understandable, operable, and robust. So those are the principles we tested against. And as Ms. Thomas said, not all of these 17 and 15% were crucial to, for example, the description of the Canadian flag not being available. That's not going to stop somebody from traveling. However, not knowing which stations or where you can access rest stops, that is something that's important.
Thank you for that. And, you know, obviously, you know, being on HUMA, you know, when I travel, I'm always looking at the airports or what have you as to who has what and what's missing. And obviously, you know, there's still many, many challenges with persons with disabilities that remain. So would you agree that this indicates that there are issues with the consultation process? Can you share your thoughts on that?
So I'll start off, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague to add a little bit of detail. Consultation needs to be meaningful, accessible, and inclusive. We did find that both Via Rail and CATSA had consultation processes that included persons with disabilities to get their input. This being said, Via Rail, we were unable to determine with Via Rail whether or not that input was actually used in part of their developing of their accessibility plan. I'm going to pass it over to Madame Forti to add a little bit of detail.
Yeah, so So we looked at the consultation process for those two entities, and the regulation requires that consultation be done for the accessibility plans of all transportation service providers. However, in our audit, we only looked at the two Crown Corporation. The other transportation service provider need to have their accessibility plan later in the upcoming months and years. So we didn't look at their consultation process and how the information was used.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Long. Madame Chabot for assessment of
6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming here and for submitting this report about the audit. The entire Office of the Auditor General does provide very precious audits on different topics. As members of Parliament, this helps us to be better informed about the accountability issues. However, your audit was informative, but when I read it, I felt I needed to know more. I understand that you may say more. When we talk about persons, you may not say more. When you talk about persons with disabilities, there are about 1 million people who encountered barriers. And as we know, persons with disabilities do not make up a homogeneous group. You have people with intellectual disabilities, there are others with physical disabilities like blindness. There are others with mobility issues, because we hear a lot about wheelchairs and then accessibility when it gets to ramps and so on. What are the most obvious barriers that we need to know about? I understand that it's difficult for you and the office to concretely identify all these barriers. And if it's difficult, what measures can be adopted? Because if we want to improve the situation and eliminate the barriers, which is the objective, we need to be able to better identify those barriers. When we read a good book, we would like to know more. So for persons with disabilities, in your opinion, what are the major barriers that they encounter with the main transporters? I'll start and then I'll ask Ms. Fortier or Mr. Duvignac to add, because I believe that that's what you want. The Canadian Transportation Agency is responsible for oversight. We found that they carried out inspections during the 2 years. Inaudible. During the pandemic, they were only able to carry out one in-person inspection, and that really limited their capacity for inspections. They identified barriers irrespective, but what was observed was that they only looked at how services, I'm sorry, I'm finding difficulty to find the words, how the services were designed and not delivered. Right now, I'll give the floor to Ms. Fortier for details. When it comes to disabilities that are encountered, there's an information source. The survey on accessibility in public sector organizations carried out by Statistics Canada, that was a good source of information. The frequency and types of barriers encountered over the past 2 years in transportation are presented. As we mentioned, one of the most common barriers are websites. So the information available on the websites, as you said, the types of barriers could be very different depending on the type of disability. The transportation mode, the type of barriers in an airport, on an airplane, and the mode could be very different. And that is why we recommended to the two public agencies that we visited to carry out more in-depth studies to analyze complaints so that they could respond to their specific context when it comes to the most serious barriers. Were they receptive? Yes, they were receptive. They accepted all our recommendations, including these two recommendations, and they prepared a plan. Are there any deadlines that are mentioned? Yes, deadlines were mentioned in their plan of action that was submitted. Mr. Chair, 1 minute. What surprised me, and I was a bit surprised to learn this, the Canadian Transportation Agency, which is the organization responsible for oversight, has only 4 people. 4 people at the Transportation Agency to oversee the application of some 400 provisions in many services. Seriously, do you think they are able to do it? Should the number of people be increased? Thank you for the question.
That 4 full-time equivalent, not necessarily four full-time equivalent staff at CTA are doing this work. It is a large number of transportation service providers. Canada is a large country. That doesn't help. But it's not up to us to say what's the right number, because it's not just the number, it's the type of inspections that are done. We noted how many inspections were done over a period of a couple of years. We also have a recommendation to CTA to look at how they're doing inspections, what type, and to look at the resources needed to do the proper inspections, because we also understand that these people have an increasing number of regulations, not just the accessibility regulations that they have to look at and inspect every year.
Madame Chabot.
Thank you, Madam Chabot.
For 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for this work that's already resulted in change. We heard today that Via Rail executives already taken up the challenge and have done the work, and I hope that their understanding of the regulations and the gaps in their services are now well understood. I just wanted to go back to the comments that were made about the audit and it being on schedule for the Crown Corps. My question is, when was the last similar audit to this, and when is the next planned?
So I'm going to hesitate to say that this is the first audit that we've done in this area. I believe the Act only came in 2019, so this is the first time we've had an opportunity to audit under the Accessible Canada Act. In terms of follow-up work, we're in the process of determining what our next audits will be, and there are certainly topics related to this one that are on our radar. Another mechanism that we use is our update on past audits, and so that's a way that we can go in and look at the observations and our findings in the current audit, and rather than going back and doing a full follow-up on to determine whether recommendations have been implemented, we follow up on whether or not the outcomes that we found in this audit may have approved or maybe not. So that's another mechanism that we're thinking of in relation to the work that we've done here.
Okay, and next question is just around you mentioned that the Crown Corps were in here, and I'm wondering when and if the airlines will be included in an upcoming audit, the next audit. I mean, we know we hear a lot of complaints about persons with disabilities and their treatment on the airlines.
So with respect to including the Crown Corporations in our audit, as our mandate allows us to, we can go in and audit those organizations. Airlines are privately owned and run corporations, and therefore they don't fall under the mandate of our work. This being said, we can do work auditing the Canada Transportation Agency to determine what they do in relation to regulating the industry.
Okay, so that kind of goes to my next question, because I did want to spend a little bit of time on complaint, because dignity is top of mind for me as I hear from residents and the way that they experience transportation. So you mentioned that the data complaint the complaint data access is limited, especially for those private corporations. We hear that in housing too. We can't get a hold of data sometimes. So you mentioned that there are certain circumstances where data is not accessible. Can you let us know where those instances are? What are those certain circumstances? And how can we as this committee or federal government help to get some of that data to help improve the experience for travelers with a disability?
So you've highlighted many of the reasons why complaint data is very, very important. So I'll go right into where the CTA currently does not have access, and I'll ask my colleagues to add details. So at present, if there is a complaint made to an airline, for example, it is the individual sending that complaint who decides where the complaint goes. If it goes simply to the airline, then the Canadian Transportation Agency does not become aware of that complaint. To give a comparison, in the United States, every complaint that goes to an airline also goes to the U.S. Transportation Board. Therefore, in the United States, they get access to airline complaints, including, for example, if a Canadian airline it has a complaint made against them. Therefore, that gives them the opportunity to receive the data, to identify barriers, and to take actions, whereas right now in Canada, the CTA doesn't have that possibility. That's as a result of their own mandate and their authority. I will ask if there's any details to add.
And I think maybe I can add that, CTA, we've noted this, and CTA, of course, we did get information from CTA. They agree that they should have broader access to information. We are not in a position to demand or request that legislation be changed, and the CTA has in their response they've outlined some of the actions, and I believe that they will be asking for a broader access to this information, as Ms. Casey said, to Ms. Thomas said, as the U.S. regulators have right now.
So just quick question with an answer then. So do you believe that this committee should also make that recommendation that complaints go to the CTA as well so that they can have data to analyze?
I think that the members of parliament and committees have an opportunity to influence in a way that as an office in our mandate we cannot. So I think that it's up to the committee to decide what it would like to do.
I'll take that away. So just in relation to the audits, was there any intersections identified such as gender, age, race? Was there any data collected in those categories that are protected under our charter?
We didn't see any of the in details, but we did recommend that a data strategy be put in place, and a data strategy may allow the transportation service provider to be able to do those analysis and intersectionality. But it's not something that was available because there was not a broad data strategy in place to be able to capture the data and to have the data in a way that could allow those analysis.
Okay, and then I have very quickly, for my next one, I wanted to talk about the training on physical assistance. So I have heard from my constituents, many of them women, that have had a late flight or have come back late, and they have been transferred from their seat to their chair by potentially a baggage handler or someone that has not been trained or does not want to do that work. So my question is this something that you heard about or that arose in your audit where you found out that, I mean, we've obviously seen that people have not necessarily been trained, but did you feel that there were people in other areas, such as baggage handlers, that were being asked to ensure passenger transfers?
Access to this type of details. What we saw that the regulation had training requirements and when it was done and not done. So we didn't have the specific mapping of those individual cases.
Thank you, Madame Cirillo. Madame Martinez-Serrata.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, je voulais juste.
Thank you, Chair. I would like some clarification on the time we're ending committee work. We started later. I know it may require consent from all members for us to end at 5:30. We want to make sure that all members have equal time to ask their questions before the end of the committee meeting. Do members agree with my proposal?
So there's just one round. So, Madame Chabot.
I think I agree with the question asked by my colleague we should have equal time. You will be making the assessment to make sure that everyone has equal time so we avoid what we experienced during the last committee meeting. Thank you.
Well, merci, Madame Chabot.
Thank you, Madam Chabot.
I take direct. I take direction
I'm vice president.
I am vice chair.
I can leave. I can leave. You will be in the chair, Madame. Okay. So we're using time. Yes, we normally go into 2 5s and 2 2.5s, but we just have the one round. So there's been a suggestion that we continue with the same rotation, but 5 minutes each. Is there agreement? 5 5 5 instead of dropping to 2.5. I can call it for a vote on it. The committee tells me what it wants to do. Seeing no objection, then...
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
So just so that I'm clear, you're saying that you want to change the normal practice of I mean, because questions are done based on the number of elected officials from each party that are here. So to have all 4 parties have all the same amount of time isn't fair to the members that are at the table here. So I think that we should continue on with the normal practice that we have and the normal time that we have. Mm-hmm. That's what's fair to the elected members that are sitting at the table here, with all due respect.
Thank you, Ms. Gray, but I do have a suggestion that seems to, I can put it to a vote. The committee determines its own path forward on these issues. I don't want to belabor the point. Is there a will to divide the time up equally 5 5 5 and 5 as we move forward?
Chair?
Yes?
I have a suggestion. Let's, if we're just basically, we have one more round, then let's, we have 2 more rounds? I thought you said 1 round.
No, we're at 5:30, and then the committee can choose after 5:30. That's our allotment time. Yeah.
Just for clarity, we do another round of how many minutes, and then we can get 2 more rounds in, correct?
We should be able to.
Yeah, so if we're doing the 2 more rounds, it's, yeah.
So the request was to continue, to continue to proceed on 5 5 5s and 5s as we proceed through. Okay, I don't see a consensus. So without a consensus, I'm reluctant to move away from practice. So then we'll continue with the agreed to. Ms. Falk for 5.
Thank you very much, Chair. We know that this audit highlights some shortcomings in barrier-free transportation here within Canada. And we also know that the Minister of Disability Inclusion intended on a framework legislative approach for the Canada Accessibility Act, which was C81 a couple parliaments ago. And that leans almost entirely on regulations with that act. So I'm just wondering, are the regulations that have been developed sufficient in achieving the goal of a barrier-free Canada by the goal of 2040? Or are there regulatory or legislative changes that would need to be done in order to achieve that goal?
So thank you very much for the question, and I'm going to start off by saying that 2040 is a long time away, and that's a long time for people living with disabilities to wait for those changes to be made. With respect to changes in legislation, regulations, and policies, those are decisions that are outside of our mandate. We look at the implementation of those regulations. My colleagues may have some insights into the effects and the impact of the regulations, but in terms of changes to them themselves, that's something that we typically don't do. I'll ask my colleagues if they have anything to add.
Maybe just to add, as Ms. Thomas said, 2040 is a long time away, and we have seen some progress on accessibility. We hope that the progress continues and that it's front-loaded rather than rather than making a lot more necessary progress closer to 2040. So that's our hope. We've identified in our audit a number of areas that we think can be improved, and given that the organizations we audited have agreed to the recommendations and they have plans to make changes with reasonable timelines, we are cautiously optimistic that the area of accessibility will continue to positively move forward, hopefully at a good pace.
Did you have anything to add, Ms. Forte? No?
I could add something quick. We looked at two regulations. The first regulation is kind of the standard, the baseline, and the second regulation is the detailed one where each one can identify their barriers in consultation with person with disability. So if the tools of consultation with person with disability is used to identify what are the gaps and what are the way forwards to fix those gaps, those regulations can be used to move the sticks forward quite a lot.
Thank you very much. I know, as Mr. Long mentioned, I was here during C81, and everything. I was very frustrated with it because it seemed like it came in at the 11th hour. We had to just pass it and get it done. We were very much focused on accountability, understanding that when we are consulting with persons with disability, sometimes that will look different. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're sitting in a room having a conversation. There could be aides that are involved from various levels. Even when we look at how people can get to the consultation point, obviously that was pre-COVID, and the virtual realm wasn't as adapted everywhere. I just wanted to ask also, in regards to CATSA, how did CATSA not know that the regulations required their management to take accessibility training? Because it's quite alarming to me that that's not something that was understood that should be done. Especially when we have because this is a culture change. This is something that needs to be discussed, and it has to be at the forefront. And that lens, that accessibility lens, has to be put on there. So I'm just wondering why they wouldn't know that that's something that needed to be done.
It's something that could be asked of them. What we do know, though, is that CATSA, the service that is delivered by third-party contractor services. So that might be a reason why it was more difficult to see what applied to CATSA, the Crown Corps, versus people on the floor that are not CATSA's employee, but really delivered by third-party screening, security screening contractors.
So would that be too many middlemen in between, or we don't?
Different organizations, so different groups of. They had training in place for the people who were on the floor and for the managers of people who were on the floor, because the service delivery is really organized with the third-party screening contractor. It's the way that the business is handled.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mr. Van Bynen for 5 minutes.
Witnesses coming forward and giving us some enlightened perspectives. Last year, I optimized my own personal website for a wide range of impairments, including visual, auditory, motor, and cognitive. And the new accessibility options allow my website to be utilized by more people in my riding in Newmarket Aurora and the users across the country. And in my opinion, websites have comprehensive accessibilities that should be a universal feature. And then while the data suggests that website accessibility is an area that needs growth in the travel sector, can you point to any examples of progress with web alternate formats for visually impaired travelers?
I'm not sure that we have the technical details to go there. What we looked at the website of the entity. We did see that the website of the regulator of CTA was faring quite well. And for the rest, we really just rely on the regulation as it stands with the criteria that were part of the regulation, and we tested those on the existing website and found the deficiencies that can be addressed.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm looking at is that it seems that the role of government is to set goals and objectives. Seems that the challenge is in implementation and in changing the culture and gaining commitment. So when I was working with the bank, one of the rules of thumb that we had was that there must be at least 3 layers of management that are firmly committed to the new principles and the processes. Was there any evidence that that was an embedded culture in any of the organizations that you reviewed?
I think in general, during our audit, which took about 12 months, plus or minus, we did get a better understanding of the culture at the 3 organizations we audited, and it's hard to get concrete evidence, but we do believe, including that the answers and the responses, and when we're clearing the audit, that the culture is changing. It's of course never fast enough, and there is progress on that front in all 3 of the organizations we audited.
So through any of these third-party contracts with the people that are actually delivering it, that's where the problem is, the delivery point. Did you ever review any of the contracts or the arrangements to ensure that any incentive programs would reflect progress as far as implementing the Accessibility Act? So would people be rewarded for doing the right thing?
We didn't look at that specifically. However, we did look at, for example, training. So we look at the training programs at VIA and at CATSA, including the training programs that were used to train third-party service providers. And we did note that in most cases the training was adequate. Some of the deficiencies with the training, and for example for CATSA, we noted one specific deficiency in terms of training how to handle a support person for somebody with accessibility, and we also noted a couple of gaps in training for VIA.
Do you feel that there should be some reporting standards for the accessibility data, particularly with respect to accumulating the complaints that we're receiving, and should that be one of the government steps to make sure that this advances at a better pace?
So in terms of data, we have in our section, especially with respect to CTA, we talk about training. We've discussed it, that it would be ideal if they had access to more of the data, like their counterparts in the U.S. We found that the data that CATSA and VIA had, they were managing complaints on a one-by-one basis. In our view, it's better to have a broader view, so a better data strategy, which involves a number of things, would give them a better view of what's happening out there, as opposed to taking care of on a case-by-case basis, which is good, but seeing the broader picture.
Consolidation makes things more visible and modifies programs. Are there any organizations in the transportation portfolio that are doing good work in terms of training and providing physical assistance? So are there some best practices that should be shared amongst these organizations?
Well, we have to say that the Two Crown Corporation, even if there were gaps, the Two Crown Corporation had put in place some program in place that were already developed, and we're continuing to develop them. So just continuing to do what the regulation asks and continuing to further improve and do the refresher is the way that can be that we can continue to improve.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. Madame Chabot pour 2 minutes et demie.
Ms. Chabot, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We know that the Canadian Transportation Agency falls under the Transportation Department. there was a report that was submitted after the audit. How has the minister himself reacted to that report? Our conversations are with executives in the various entities. We do not audit the department itself. We had a briefing with him, and I believe that the department was receptive to our recommendations, and the audit was appreciated, and he said that he was going to implement our recommendations. As a minister responsible for the transportation agency, and when we look at the difficulties the agency encountered to prepare the report, we expect that things will change. There's something you said during your opening remarks. In their request for data on complaints, they couldn't make all requests. That's the agency. Do you have recommendations on how access to data could be improved for the agency? Some complaints are subject to the airlines, so it takes a change in regulations to give them the possibility to have access to that. Am I mistaken, or does this appear to be a major concern? Sometimes a complaint is classified according to the nature of the complaint and not because it's been submitted by a person with disabilities. Even the data we have, well, I'm not criticizing your audit. The idea of our study is to find out how we can strengthen the agency and the department to make sure that we have a clear picture of the situation if we want to improve the situation. And I agree with you that I hope we'll be able to meet our objectives by 2040. So I'm trying to see what types of recommendations we could make in our committee to strengthen the capacities for data, to have more precise data, and also to allow the transportation agency to fully play its role. Concerning the complaints, you are right. Complaints are categorized or classified by type and not by the person submitting it. So it's sometimes not possible to find out whether there were trends or opportunities for change and to take decisions to improve the situation for persons with disabilities. I'll ask thank you, Madam Chabot and Ms. Thomas.
Is it you or Ms. Barron?
Me, thank you very
Okay.
much. And then Ms. Barron will be taking up the next round of questioning for me. I'll start by just saying it seems there is a message out of the Senate that the House of Commons motion to the Senate or about amendments to the Bill C-22 has been adopted in the Senate. So I guess it is on its way, Mr. Chair. Okay, I just wanted to speak a little bit about mechanisms to ensure targets are met in regulatory requirements. So it's mentioned here in the report that the target, I think, was 80% and it was 69% met. So I'm just wondering if there are fines or if there are sanctions. Like, what is the mechanism to ensure targets are met, and what do we do if they aren't?
The regulator has a continuum of activity that they put in place to make sure that there is compliance, from informative discussion to, and they can issue fines. During our audit, they were more at the early stage of their continuum in terms of what they did to ensure compliance, and we did see that this was removing some of the barriers. Since our audit has been completed, we did see in the public information available from the agency that some fines were issued in other cases.
So there was fines that were issued?
On the public site of the regulator, there's information available.
Okay, and can that information be submitted to this committee?
It's public information, sure.
That would be great. Thank you so much. So I wanted to just get back to the question of dignity and persons with disabilities having equal access and dignity to travel. And I wanted to ask specifically about third-party training. Was there any numbers around, and I note that the third parties were doing more training than the actual agencies themselves, especially at the executive and management level, but is there any numbers around what percentage of work is outsourced and what their turnover rates are like? I'm just trying to understand how much training would be involved with third-party usage.
For CATSA, it's the service in the airports that are all delivered by third-party screening contractor. This is part of their certification process that they be trained before they start. We did see that over the summer there were a lot of new hiring. There was a lot of discussion in the newspapers about this situation. So we did see that it was part of their certification process before they start to be on the floor. So we noted that as a good practice to make sure that people delivering the service on the floor had their training done.
And would the agency be able to understand what that turnover rate is like and how much training would go on? Because I think that would probably be part of the contracts, you know, the cost of the contracts to make sure that people are being trained adequately. And is there any information about what turnover rates are in third party?
We don't have this information. We just know that for CATSA, it's part of the certification process. So any new employees need to be certified. And as part of the certification process, any new contractor need to be certified, and as part of the certification process, there is the training on accessibility.
Thank you, Ms. Zarillo. Your time. Ms. Ferrari, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time and insight into this important study. And you know, I think it's really important to look at this. I think a lot of us don't know what we don't know when it comes to barriers, and nobody really knows what a barrier is until you don't have access. So thanks for your work on this. There's a couple things that jumped out at me when I was looking at your report. And for those watching at home, the report is the Accessible Transportation for Persons with Disabilities Reports of the Auditor General of Canada to the Parliament of Canada. And in the last section here at the overall message, it said the Canadian Transportation Agency has very limited authority to request complaint data from the transportation service providers. Why?
It's simply not in their mandate to be allowed to collect that information, as far as we understand.
At the current time, and as we noted also, we do have a recommendation in this area. They do, of course, agree with the idea of having more access to data, full data, like their U.S. counterparts on the U.S. side. And we believe that they will be looking to get further access.
But you're saying, the way this is written, it says to request. So why would requesting data be? I understand if they don't have to, if they're not mandated to give it, but you're saying that they have a very limited authority to request it.
The regulation, the direct allows them to have access to some information where they're doing a special evaluation assessment of a specific case. So in those contexts, they may be able to ask the transportation service provider to have access to the information. If it's a case that goes to their court, the court side of the agency, for example, but they don't have the mandate, and they don't have the right to regularly access this information, kind of on ongoing basis of just give us the counts of complaints that you receive related to accessibility on an annual or monthly basis. They don't have this right. It's only part of their investigation when there is a specific complaint that is being put in place that they can ask about information.
So when I think about request for information, or that if they don't provide it, there's no consequence, is what you're saying, basically, right? Is that fair? Yes? Okay, I'm seeing ahead. That's good. Okay, so according to Statistics Canada, 1 in 5 Canadians aged 15 and over have one or more disabilities that could limit their participation in everyday activities. Of the 2.2 million persons with disabilities who used federally regulated transportation in 2019 and 2020, 63%, or 2/3, which is a significant, faced a barrier. I guess as auditors, my question to you would be, what's a realistic goal or number? Is 0 realistic, to have 0% facing a barrier? And what is that timeline? Like, I know you mentioned that 2040 is too long to wait, but we also know that businesses are burdened with so many things, and it is challenging. It is absolutely challenging to make things accessible. It's costly. There's a lot of things. I don't think it comes from a lack of compassion. But what do you think is a realistic number from an auditor's perspective versus 63%?
With, we're probably not going to be able to give you a number. Every Canadian has the right to fully participate in society, and I think that consultation is critically important. Part of the Act, one of the main principles is nothing without us, and therefore that number should be the objective of the Act is to eliminate barriers, and that should be the objective of the organizations.
And I understand your position, you don't want to give a number, but I think a goal is really important to draw a line in the sand of what we should expect. And I think, to be fair, of course, I think there's unanimous consent. Everybody agrees every human deserves that right. But what is a realistic goal to achieve in terms of a number?
I think the goal of the Government of Canada is to eliminate all barriers, and therefore the organizations need to work towards eliminating barriers.
What time frame?
The time frame that has been given is 2040, and that is the legislated requirement. We're hopeful that organizations, as Mr. Juvignac said, can front load getting those barriers removed, as opposed to waiting till the very end, closer to that deadline.
Do you think that the government right now, the way that it's currently operating, is on trajectory to meet that goal?
The organizations that we looked at, they have accepted our recommendations. They have action plans in place, and we're cautiously optimistic that the organizations within this audit can make movement towards that objective and can positively achieve that.
Thank you, Ms. Ferrari. Mr. Coteau, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for being here today. This report is, without a question, a very important document, and I'm glad that that the organization is focusing on disabilities. Have you done reports like this before, within other sectors, specifically around disabilities? Is this the first of its kind?
Yes, this is the first one we've done since the Act was put in place in 2019.
Okay. I'm going to focus a little bit on the, and I'm assuming there's going to be more, right? Because you could apply this to so many other things, like just accessibility, correct? Yeah?
Absolutely. We're in our planning stage right now for our future audits, and there are definitely audits that are touching on this subject that are on our list right now to determine which we're going to do in 2025 and further out.
Okay. I noticed that in the actual user's experience with online technology, you used a data standard a standard from the World Wide Web Consortium. It was the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. Is that like an international standard?
Yes, that's an international standard, and this is the standard that is required to be compliant to as per the accessible transportation for persons with disability regulations.
So is that used all around the world?
It's used in many organizations. There is a new version. Sometimes in Europe, they use a variant of this standard, but it is under the same principle that is being used. It's the same approach. It's 2.0 versus 2.1. Very technical details. I'm sorry to go there.
Did you look at other standards that were out there and just determine that this was the best one? Or
we picked this one because this is the one that was required in the regulation in the Canadian
regulation.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
Yes.
I also noticed that in some of the findings, you actually use data from 2001 from Stats Canada and apply it to a report in 2023. But the technology is so different. There's so many changes. So How did you justify taking data from 2021 and applying it to 2023 and applying it to these organizations? So, it says that, for example, using websites to make reservations or look for information, 3 out of 10 travelers, this is on page 9, according to Statistics Canada Accessibility in the Federal Sector Organization Survey. So is that a fair assessment 2 years later to apply to this report?
We used the data that was available. It was a very relevant data for our purpose, and it was for people who had traveled both before the pandemic and during the pandemic, because the experience may be different there as well.
And when I found, like, for example, 17%, 17% of people, 17% of the online content tested, this is 1.3 at Via Rail, did not meet the required standards. How did you find that out? Just using that criteria and applying it?
Yes, we selected a sample of criteria. We looked at some selected page on the sites of each Crown Corporation, and we use expert in web accessibility to do the testing, as well as person with disability who did testing on our behalf as well.
So now I'm getting a little bit too detailed, but did you find that the variance of programs used by the end user sometimes varied so much it was hard to really apply to that testing? Because I was part of an organization that looked at just digital literacy, for example, and we found that it was really hard because there's so many different types of programs, legacy programs people are using for 15 years because they work so well, that sometimes when different script changes, it becomes more difficult. Was there a way to get over that challenge?
We clearly did not have all of the tools and everything, but we looked at some of the top 2 tools that are used for screen readers, for example, in a variety of browsers and approach, which seem to be the more frequently used as a representation of this. But we didn't test all of the tools that could be used. We use a selective approach of what could be tested to get those results.
So when a report like this comes out and you have organizations like Via Rail, is there follow-up meetings to figure out how they're going to move forward on some of these recommendations, specifically around accessing the online information?
So absolutely, our process is that during the course of the audit, we interact with them frequently. We share the draft recommendations with them to ensure that they're actually going to achieve the outcomes that we think the recommendation is going to achieve. We then table the report. They're then responsible for putting together both responses to our recommendations within our report, but then also an action plan in relation to the Public Accounts Committee hearing. And they have put together their action plan and shared that with that committee.
Well, thank you for the great work. I know that my time's probably up. I can feel the chair looking
Yes.
at me. But thank you so much for this work, and I hope this is the start of an ongoing process to increase more accessibility for people in Canada. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Cattell. Before we move to Ms. Gray, it looks like we'll have time for one full round, which is, that's what my notes are, 5, 5, 2.5, and 2.5, if that's the wish of the committee. So 5 minutes to who? Is it Mr. Aitchison? My note says Ms. Gray, but if you do that, we'll not get to Mr. Aitchison. So,
Thank you, Mr.
as you
Chair.
choose.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we moved a few things around there. So thank you again for being here today. One of the things I wanted to touch on was the report revealed that Via Rail and Canadian Air Transport Security Authority took steps towards engaging with persons with disabilities for specific activities when they should have consulted more broadly, such as on teaching methods for accessible training. Now, based on your observations, was this a priority of those organizations?
Point
of order.
Mr. Chair, I think you forgot the opposition here on the questions.
No.
They should have.
I said 2, 5, 2, 5, 5, 2.5, and 2.5.
You missed 2.5 and 2.5.
No?
After Michael. Yes.
Maybe we need the vice chair.
I'm following the approved routine.
Can't be.
I'm following the approved order that we go through when we're moving through a sequence like this, which is subsequent rounds, because we did not go with 2 panels. We just went 1. So that I'm following the approved procedure.
So can we just allow the two groups to, the two members to finish up? What do they get, 2 minutes? 2 members? 2 minutes? Yeah, so we're going to do that, yeah?
Yes. Please. Just now with Ms. Gray, so it's a good time. Yes, we're because there's only one group of 1 witness, we're following the approved order. I'm following the approved order. So we'll end with 2 5s and 2.5. So, Miss Gray, we'll start with your 5 minutes. Ms. Gray, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So maybe I'll just go through that again there then. So I wanted to touch base on the consultation part. So Via Rail and Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, they took steps towards engaging with persons with disabilities for specific activities when they should have consulted more broadly, such as on teaching methods for accessible training. And so based on your observations, was that a priority of the organization, or what's your sense when you were doing the audit on this particular issue? Where their focus was.
I'm just a little unclear on what their priority in terms of the teaching methods, or
in terms of the teaching methods for accessible training. Yeah.
So I believe when the consultations were carried out, there was direction to participants to not talk about teaching methods because they really wanted to focus on the content of the training as well. I do believe that afterwards we did some follow-up work and determined that there was no follow-up in relation to teaching methods. I'll look to my colleagues to see if I've missed anything there.
Great, thank you. With regards to the complaint, so in the report you had from 2017 to 2022 that Via Rail and the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority categorized complaints under persons with disabilities. There was 83 complaints specifically. However, it said that there was more than 1,000 which were made by or on behalf of persons with disabilities, and those were categorized by the operational nature of the complaint. So do you know why this data was not leveraged to identify and prevent barriers to accessible travel, and why it was categorized the way that it was?
So what CATSA did was they received the information and categorized them, as you said, by their nature. For example, those if they had been capturing them by status, it would have meant that, for example, a complaint that was lodged about a service dog, as opposed to being lodged as a complaint about security screening, it might have been lodged in relation to a person with a disability. Had they done that, that would have given them the opportunity to better analyze the data and understand whether or not other actions or should have been taken. Anything to add? No.
So this is in relation to the data strategy that we talked about, and we have a recommendation, and they've agreed with it with the objective of getting a broader picture with a cleaner, more concise and consolidated data set.
Great, thank you. And that's sort of looking forward. But do you think that there's a way to capture the data that's already there, and a way of disseminating it, like a way of recovering that data and categorizing it differently, or is it sort of you did the best that you could based on what was provided, and it's more like here's the recommendation for moving forward? Is that sort of the state where it was left at?
I suspect that they've collected the data, they have the information, and it would be up to them to determine what they can now do with that data. I'm not as familiar with it to determine whether or not it's an easy to go back and do work, or if this would be more for them moving forward to ensure that they accurately capture the information, analyze it, and then use it for decision making.
Great, thank you. And as part of that, I guess looking at what the information is being used for. Is there anything that you're aware of in your audit that you came across from from the regulator's point of view? Like, are there opportunities there that maybe should be looked at as well from a regulatory point of view, not just from an individual organization point of view, but actually from a regulator point of view, whether it's policy or sort of benchmarks? Is there anything that you came across as part of that process that maybe should be looked at from the regulator's point of view?
So we definitely referred to in the report about the complaint data and the limitations that are currently in place. I'll ask if there was anything else that we came across.
No. Well, in the regulation for the plans and reporting on accessibility, there is a component where they, in future report, they can report on the feedback that they have received, and it could be part of a data strategy to report on their complaint as part of that reporting.
I just wanted to ask sort of more of a general comment on the oversight from the regulator. Like, in the analysis that you did, do you feel that up to this point that it's been more of a reactionary as opposed to a proactive approach on this? And because they are the regulator, I mean, they're the ones to hold the organizations to account and make sure that they're fulfilling fulfilling objectives in the act. So do you think that they've been more reactionary to this point based on your analysis?
What we found was that they were finding barriers and identifying those that could be removed. And in fact, in one of our exhibits, we show those that were identified and those that were removed. One of the limitations that we did find was that their inspections were really focused on the design. They didn't actually go and test the actual service delivery. And so that would be an area where they could improve.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Gray. Madame Martinez Ferrara for 5 minutes.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to tell you a small story, and I believe it's going to be interesting to see what you think. My brother has been disabled from birth, and we traveled a lot with him. He's 38 years old. We traveled a lot with him by air, and every time it's been complicated. Not only is it complicated to get him to his seat, when it's a baby, when it's a young person, no problem. But when it's an adult, 35, 38 years old, traveling on a wheelchair, it's difficult. So looking at the data, and you've just talked about service delivery, and I'm wondering, what would you like to see in our report on how those services should be assessed? Because my brother at some point had to be moved by firefighters because there was no one around to be able to move him from his seat. And a number of seats had also been damaged. So I would like to know what you think about it. Maybe comment a bit on service delivery, even only on the airlines. Thank you for your very personal story. That is very touching. I cannot even imagine your situation. It's unbelievable that we travel very often. We always have complaints. Our luggage is damaged. But that is nothing compared to damaged equipment or equipment that doesn't arrive. I would like to ask my colleagues to add any specific information.
A very sensitive area. We've seen it. We see it through our audit. We've seen it through the eyes of some of the people experts that we have hired as advisors. We've seen a number of cases, high-profile cases, and of course in the newspapers and media. This, in our view, all starts with a high-level consultation with persons with disabilities. Then we drop down to training. So we tested training. We looked at the programs and so on. Then when we get to the actual physical move, there needs to be certain machines helping aids to do this. And you have to have the right person that's properly trained for that machine with a machine in place to be able to offer the service that the person needs. Hopefully it happens. We know that it doesn't happen all the time. It's unfortunate, and then we get into cases where, such as you're describing.
Ça m'amène aussi à la question.
This takes me to the question of the rights of travelers. The minister presented new measures to transfer the weight of these measures upon the transporter. In your opinion, how could this help with accessibility?
Regarder cette partie de la règlement.
We did not look at that section of the regulation. That is something that is independent on the regulations on accessibility. That was not part of our study, unfortunately, so I cannot comment on that. My question is, do you think it could be applied to accessibility? Could you please repeat the question?
Is on regards of the passengers' right regime. Do you think that the passengers' right regime, that the minister reviewed the message of that regime, could that be applied to the accessibility?
C'est une chose peut-être qu'on peut commenter, c'est
What we can say is that from what we see on the types of complaints on accessibility, there are very specific cases, and it's very different from what we see for complaints for passengers. So that may require a more individual examination or study. But when it comes to access to information, for the regulator could help us better understand what is happening and to act. I was trying to establish a link and damage to property like a wheelchair or electric wheelchair is not the same cost as for lost baggage. And then the time it takes to recover a wheelchair could be months. It takes a long time. So there's a cost associated to the quality of life of the person who cannot have access to the wheelchair. So I was trying to associate that with the passenger rights. You talked a lot about data. Could you be more clear on the type of data you would like to evaluate, that you would have liked to evaluate more? In the American regulations, air transporters must provide the number of mobility chairs that were transported and the number of damages. So just to have that type of information could be helpful here in Canada. Thank you. Madam Chabot, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you. I would like to thank my colleague for the testimony because there are specific situations that we experience when we travel with disabled people. Sometimes we do realize the difficulties that are associated with this. And sometimes it's not only laborious, but even disgraceful. So how can we improve the situation? I understand that people can lodge a complaint. There are complaint mechanisms. It's not always easy afterwards to identify them. The consultation mechanism, well, I'm trying to compare this to the health system, the health and social services system. Sometimes there's a complaint. You want to lodge a complaint, but sometimes you're hoping that somebody may respond to that complaint someday. And if that happens, you're happy. Well, I imagine that this doesn't fall under your mandate to carry out consultations with people who are targeted by any reports. How do they experience this? Whether or not they lodged a complaint. How can we be sure that there are more testimonies? How do we identify those people? During our audit, we contacted 3 people for such questions. I would like to ask my colleagues if they have any more details. Do we have reports on that? It's not a report. It's just a mechanism that we use to better understand besides our auditors.
that we look for them for advice, and these are people with lived experiences. Throughout the audit, we also consulted and we spoke to many organizations with broad that either have or represent broad areas of people that have various disabilities. It really, I mean, every conversation starts and ends with the fact that the most important part is consultations with people with persons with disabilities. The idea of nothing without us. That and also the second thing that comes out through these discussions is prevention. So putting in place by consulting with persons with disabilities, there's a much higher chance of preventing issues, and then if it's not prevented, then we get into identification and removal or mitigation of various obstacles. That's why our objective talks about identifying, removing, and preventing barriers.
Madame Chabot, well over. To conclude and welcome Ms. Barron, we sit on another committee together, so we could not have you participate here, attend and not participate. So Ms. Barron, you have 2.5 minutes to conclude.
Thank you, Chair, and it's nice to see you in the chair role. And thank you to the witnesses. I'm happy to be here even just for a short portion of this important study. I'm happy that this work is being done, and looking at the report that's being provided, it looks like there's some good work happening, so that's good. When I'm looking through the report, and now I don't know if this has come up already, but I'm seeing mentions of many of these invisible disabilities, brain injury, mental illness. But when I'm looking at the framing around the regulation, the examples on how to provide accessibility and so on, it seems to be very focused on physical disabilities, which are very important. However, brain injury, mental illness, for example, are very interconnected, and also a very important part of this discussion. And I'm wondering if you can share, has it been looked at? I know in my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith, we have what's called mental health first aid, so people know how to respond when somebody is having a symptom of a mental illness, for example. Has any of that been looked at through this process?
So I'll start off by talking about consultation and how important consultation is, and you're right, it needs to be done with a variety of persons with disabilities and a variety of experiences. And I think it's through those types of consultations where barriers can be identified and then removed. I'm going to ask my colleagues if they have anything to add about what we found during the course of our audit work.
In our audit work, we looked at it through the training component. Like there is mandatory training component that need to be included, that included elements about the various types of disability, including disability that may not be visible or the type of disability that you were mentioning. And these type of training need to be included in the training content. And for the organization that we looked at, it was included.
And you were
Thank you.
disturbed
No, I'm sorry.
by
It was
that.
really hard to hear
Yes.
the responses with the conversations happening. They were right in
Please.
the microphone, yeah.
Please, in the back, respect
Yeah.
the committee members
So
participating.
hopefully the translators
Yes.
caught it, and yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Continue on, Ms. Barron. You have time for
thank you
another
very
question,
much.
then we'll
So
conclude.
I think I got the gist of your answer, but I don't have a follow-up because I didn't catch all of it, unfortunately. So maybe could you just give me in a few words what it was that you were saying there?
Sure. I
Thank you.
mentioned that consultation is very important, and that consultation needs to be held with a variety of persons with disabilities in order to not just address one type of disability, but to enable that all barriers, regardless of the type of disability, can be identified, prevented, and or removed.
And what I said was about the training. There is a mandatory training content, and we did look at if the content included a description of the various type of disability and some of the elements that you were mentioning about invisible disability and other elements that are a little bit maybe sometimes less thought about because less visible.
Thank you, Ms. Barron, and thank you to the witnesses. That concludes today's meeting, and actually probably concludes the committee's schedule within this particular session. So to all committee members, thank you for your participation, and do have a very good summer. Meeting adjourned.
Wait.